So good morning, everyone, and welcome to Progressive Democrats forum on first of several forums on housing. I am Peter Enrich. I'm the chair of Progressive Democrats, and I'm going to be facilitating today's conversation. Just a couple of prefatory notes. First, as you probably saw, we are recording this, and the recording will be available to all of you and to everyone else who's interested in the day or two after today's event. We would appreciate it if you would keep yourselves muted during the discussion. We encourage people to refrain from using the chat to try and carry on side conversations, which we find is distracting. If you have questions that you want to post there, that would be great. How much time we're going to have, there's an awful lot we're going to try and be covering today. We don't know how much time we'll have for questions, but we certainly welcome your putting those in the chat, or if you have links of things that you think would be important and that are relevant, we welcome that as well. Let me just start by saying a few words about Progressive Dems and these forums. Then I will introduce our amazing panelists and we will get down to business. So Progressive Democrats has been around for 20 years now. We're actually celebrating our 20th anniversary this summer. If you're planning to be at the State Democratic Convention, I hope you'll join us for our celebration. We are a statewide network of grassroots activists. We work to elect more progressive candidates. We work on a selected set of issues. We provide training and support to other grassroots activists. And we hope we've helped make the state a more progressive place over the past 20 years. For the last, starting a couple of years ago, we've been doing these forums more or less on a monthly basis on what we see as some key issues of concern and interest to the progressive community. And we decided this year that housing really needed to be a focal issue for us, as it is for so many others already. And we started looking into it, and the more we looked, the more we realized that this was an extraordinarily complex issue with extraordinarily many dimensions, problems, solutions, and decided that the best way that we could start to stick our toe into these issues was to host a series of forums, not a single one, but a series that try to really unpack what the issues in this area are and what the work that we as progressives can and should be doing. And so this is the kickoff of what we're anticipating will be a series of about a half a dozen forums spread out over the remainder of this year. We're not going to do any in July and August because we think people may be distracted, but we will pick up again in September and do several more. The goal of today's forum is really just to provide an introduction and overview of what the problem is and how it impacts people's lives, and then to give just a first look at what we're seeing as the major areas that need to be explored over the subsequent forums as we try and dig into what the policy levers are, where the sources of the problems are, what strategies can address them. And we'll introduce what we see as some of the major themes for that in the latter part of today's discussion. And then that'll be the areas that we'll dig in more deeply in the fall. So with that said, let me introduce, we are thrilled by the panel that we are bringing together today. These are people who are absolutely the very most knowledgeable and thoughtful people we could think of in our survey of who's working on these issues in Massachusetts. Although I gotta say, I see a few other experts and people who we are hoping will provide expert wisdom over time on the Zoom screens today, and welcome to all of you as well. So let me introduce the three panelists. First is Senator Lydia Edwards. Lydia represents the 3rd Suffolk district, which is East Boston, Revere, Winthrop. She was first elected in 2022. And before that, Lydia was on the Boston City Council for about 5 years. Before that, she was at Greater Boston Legal Services. I first knew her before that when she was at the Brazilian Immigrant Center, where she did just absolutely amazing work on domestic workers' rights. Each step in her career, she has just made huge contributions. And she is now the Senate chair of the Joint Committee on Housing, where she's really focusing in on something that has been a focus of her work throughout her career. So we're thrilled to have you here, Lydia. Thank you. Second is Keith Fairey. Keith is presently, has been since 2020, the Chief Executive Officer of Wayfinders, which is a Western Massachusetts community development organization that does a wide variety of things to strengthen housing stability. It provides support services, it provides its own housing, it provides financing. It's a rich and complex array of critical services in Western Massachusetts. Before that, Keith spent, I think, his whole career doing various kinds of housing and community development work around the East Coast, has been a leader in the field. And here in Massachusetts, Governor Healy recruited Keith as one of the co-chairs of her housing transition team, and then recruited him again as one of the key members of the task force that she assembled to lay out a plan for the new housing secretariat to pick up on when they started their work last week. And the work of that working group is tremendously useful and provides a really good roadmap of a wide range of the issues. So Keith, delighted to have you here. And third is Josh Zakim, who is probably known to a number of you for his long career in Massachusetts public life. He served after he was one of my students at Northeastern Law School. He went on to Greater Boston Legal Services. He was then elected to the Boston City Council, where he served for, I didn't write down how many years, six years, I think. And then he ran in 2018 for Secretary of the Commonwealth, and then in 2020 became the founder of an organization that is called Housing Forward Massachusetts, which does analytic work and support of a wide range of housing programs, and has become a source of expertise for communities, for advocates on these issues. So delighted to have you too, Josh. I think we're so lucky to have this cast of experts. So I think where we want to start off is by spending a while really talking about what the problem is. And I'm sure many of you have seen different pieces of the problem. We want to try and give a broad, comprehensive picture in a short space of time. And so let me start, Josh, let me direct a first question to you. I mean, in our PDM's working groups work on this issue, we keep reading that the heart of the housing crisis is that we just don't have a large enough supply of housing. And people often say we fall short by some 200,000 units. And is that really the underlying problem?
Sure. Yeah, I think it is. And I think that 200,000 number may be on the low side. Certainly, if we want the Commonwealth to continue growing, both from a population standpoint, economically, there have been generations of of folks in the Commonwealth, and this is a nationwide problem too, and it's becoming more acute across the country, that have put barriers in the way of new housing construction, opposing multifamily housing, even when that's a 3-unit, a triple decker. Our famous triple deckers that were historically working class housing throughout greater Boston, throughout Massachusetts, and across the state. And, you know, a lot of those restrictive zoning regulations, these what I often call artificial barriers to housing, you know, the cost, the money, the investment, the materials, those are real, those are challenges, but the artificial barriers have been put in place through policy, often historically have come out of discriminatory racist motivations in many of our communities across the Commonwealth, whether it was to keep out immigrants, to keep out people of color, to keep out low-income folks from communities. And that has led, in my view, and I think in many others' view, to this crisis where there's a shortage of supply. We have more people looking for housing at all income levels, at all rents, at all price points than there exists in the Commonwealth right now. We have an opportunity to change that. It is a long-term project, though. It has taken generations to get to where we are by opposing new housing, by putting up those barriers. But there are smart policies, and I think the legislature has done great work on MBTA communities, on housing choice, making it only a 50% plus one rule for zoning approvals in cities and towns across the Commonwealth. It used to be 2/3. And there's a lot more to do. And I know with my former colleague on the city council and current chair of the Senate's side of the Joint Housing Committee is fighting that fight up at the State House. We need to do a lot more. There are things that I'll stop, because as I warned you, I can talk a lot about these issues when we set this thing up. There are 2 things. We need to increase supply. That is a long-term prospect. Even if we put perfect production policies in place, we are a decade, 2 decades away from solving that problem. So there are other interventions that need to happen in the meantime to keep people in our communities, to keep people housed. But ultimately, yes, it is a supply problem.
Thank you. So I guess one of the questions that often comes up, and Keith, maybe you can help us on this, is how long has this been an issue? Is this recent? Is this long-standing? And also, some people tend to think of this as basically a Metro Boston problem. Is that the right way to think about it?
This is a crisis that's been building for years, for decades. As we look at some of the drivers behind it, one of it is our sort of demographics, right? We have the great benefit of having baby boomers, a huge demographic bubble in our population, living longer, aging in place in their housing, and that's a great thing. But it doesn't free up the housing that generations past would be freeing up at this point in their lives. And then we have another major bubble in population, and millennials coming through, looking to start households, and can't find the housing resources that they're looking for because of the limited supply production that we've done over the years. And that's been driven by a decline in federal funding. That's the big lever here, right? The federal dollars are always the biggest, and those have been declining for decades now. And so that limits production of all kinds of housing, senior housing, affordable housing, workforce housing, that starter home that people get into for the first time to start their families and create a community with their neighbors. All those things we've been, from a public standpoint, not investing in the way we should have for decades. So that's part of the kind of the growing problem that now is exploding across the country and has been for several years. And, I worked for 15 years for a national organization, Enterprise Community Partners, and for much of that time period, we were talking about how to get housing to be an above the fold issue. It's an above the fold issue now because it's affecting everyone. And so from a geographic standpoint, here in Western Massachusetts, some may have thought that we have lots of supply. But we did a housing study with the UMass Donahue Institute over the last 2 years. And what we found is, what's our chunk of that 200,000? Well, we have an 11,000 unit housing supply gap that's projected to grow by 2025 to 19,000 units. And that's in the 3 counties that make up the greater Springfield area, Hampden, Hampshire, and Franklin County. And so this is a growing issue, and what the issue behind it is not only needing to create more supply, but losing supply. functional supply in our marketplace. Here we have lots of old and blighted property in some of our gateway cities. That's not being reinvested in, so it's sitting vacant today. And so there are opportunities not only to build new, but to reinvest in the older stock. And Massachusetts has a propensity of older stock today. And so that's part of the supply challenge. Yes, it's an undersupply, not building enough, not creating the right housing options, but also not reinvesting in the existing stock in the way we need to create the housing ladder that we need in all of our communities.
Thanks, Keith. We're going to dig deeper later today and in the following forums into sort of what are the things that are the causes of these problems, what can we do about them, what are the approaches to mitigating the harms. But I think it would be helpful to start by spending a little more time focusing on, so what are the actual effects of the shortage of housing? How does it impact people's lives? What are the real consequences of the housing shortage? And Senator, I wonder if you could start us off on that. I'd love to give each of you a chance to talk a little bit about that, but if you could start us off, Senator.
Sure, and if I could very briefly touch on the supply comment, just briefly discuss that. I do know that we are short, and we do probably, as my friend and former colleague Josh said, are well beyond the 200,000 units. I think we actually are, but I always want to finish the sentence that we need more housing for all income levels, and it's not enough to just build. It just isn't. You need to intentionally build for all income levels, and that includes providing the tax packages, the whole combination that supports the wraparound for those income levels. Why? Because at our recent housing oversight hearing, and I highly recommend you watch it, we had all these stakeholders come in, some for the first time. We invited City Life, but we also invited the Housing Court to come and testify, all aspects. But one thing I heard from Mass NARA was that we were short, that the waiting list for public housing was 170,000 people. So you 107,000 people, and that was after cleaning out 50,000 people who just didn't respond to the survey. So let me be very clear, what I'm trying to say is you can build all the luxury housing you want. The public housing list is 170,000 deep. You can build and still not meet that need. So I just want people to it's all income levels. Now, in terms of what that means when we don't build for all income levels, is that the folks like such as myself, I'm a homeowner, I live in a triple decker, and the ability for me to raise rents at an obscene level is available to me now because there's no competition, there's no availability for the workforce housing, and some people have taken advantage of that. There is the equity in the house is these triple deckers, and the ability for people to even become homeowners is harder and harder. You have to be a millionaire at this point, because to buy a triple decker or traditional starter home is at well over $100,000, $200,000 more than it used to be. It means that the lines are still getting longer because we don't have enough units. It means we're losing a population, a generation of highly educated, very likely to be making eventually a good amount of money, who we're losing our entire generational tax base to other cheaper markets. Because people want to eventually stop paying rent. They do eventually want to own a home. They want to not feel so burdened and so exhausted by this. And rent burden, I'm using the HUD definition, which is paying more than 30% of your income toward housing costs, rent, or mortgage. And we are well above that. For 70% of our population is paying almost 50% or more. So that's what that means if you don't build enough housing at all income levels, is that you will continue to price out a generation. Rents will go higher, right? And I think the racial wealth gap will get even deeper because it's harder to become a homeowner. And that still to this day is one of the greatest opportunities for generational wealth is through homeownership.
So, Josh, do you want to pitch in on the question?
I think the senator is correct, and I think we go back to not just I think, exclusionary and discriminatory zoning and land use policies, but the disinvestment that Keith mentioned earlier from the government at all levels. And I say our state and local governments in Massachusetts have been doing a lot, particularly in the last decade and a half. But the only entity that I'm aware of that has the resources, the checkbook, so to speak, to really make a dent in this and to go back to what our country used to do, which was build housing for low income, middle income folks, whether it's, there's the low income housing tax credit, which is great. There's CDBG. I mean, they are still the primary source for a lot of this, but we can do so much more on the federal level, and we need to do that. And I would say I hesitate to call it a bright spot because it is the fact that this crisis is spreading across the country, is that talking with folks who are working on this in Washington, though, they say they are getting questions. They are getting interest from more rural lawmakers, from folks who certainly would not sign up for the Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts email list or to support our causes, who are saying we have to do something about housing costs. Now, that may mean someone's rent has gone from $800 to $1,200, which we would say, in Greater Boston, wow, that's really low, but that's a 50% jump, in rural Idaho or somewhere like that. So that's something that, again, I hesitate to call it a bright spot because it means this crisis is so bad, but it is energizing folks who normally wouldn't be, I think, in this conversation, and gives me some hope on that. And also, to go on to the senator's point about housing at all income levels, I often say, and I can't say that I created this sort of concept, but that we have two housing crises, I believe, in Massachusetts. There is our low income, very low income housing crisis that can only, in my view, be solved by additional investment and subsidy. That's not going to be fixed by building more market rate housing. But we do have our middle income and even in many cases upper middle income housing crisis that we can address through zoning reform, through making it easier for people to build that sort of market rate housing. And we need to do both. And to conflate them both together, I think it can be somewhat disingenuous and does not help us solve the problem. Public investment is absolutely needed, but that also has to go hand in glove with zoning reform so that when a nonprofit developer or affordable housing developer has the resources to build, they're not stuck in a lawsuit with an abutter for 5 years, challenging them because they don't think there's enough parking or whatever the case may be. So I think we need to do both, and we can do both. Massachusetts has done it in the past. We can do it in the future, and hopefully the federal government can help us out a little bit with a checkbook at least.
So Keith, I wonder, can you say more? How does the housing shortage actually impact the lives of individual families and households?
Sure. So one of the things that it does, and for folks, Peter described the organization I have the privilege of running in Wayfinders, one of the things we do is administer Section 8 and Massachusetts rental vouchers in Hampden and Hampshire County. And so if someone is lucky enough to get a voucher, they have to search for it, but there's a limited time period which they can search for it. And because of the lack of supply, we're seeing people hitting up against that deadline. And eventually, when they hit against that deadline, while we do as much as we can to help them find housing, they lose the opportunity for that voucher. They are timed out. Another way that we see this emerging as a real issue, the issues around supply, is with the limited supply, as Josh mentioned, there's an increase in costs also that's happening for all of us, and that's for owners and landlords. And they're passing those costs on to their tenants, right? And so in a place like Western Massachusetts, we have significantly lower incomes than folks in the eastern part of the state. For Black and Hispanic households, they're even lower. And actually, going into the pandemic, their incomes were really flat over the 5-year period going in, where we saw white and Asian households have 5-figure gains in their income. At the same time, here in Western Massachusetts, we saw significant increases in rents, and we never saw any dips. And so I know in hot markets in Greater Boston, they were trying to retain people. So you saw 10% drops, 15% drops in rent. That didn't happen here. We saw 5, 8, 10% increases in rents with flat incomes, and that were already low. So what that does in our offices every day is drives people here for emergency rental assistance. And so we have had unprecedented amounts of emergency rental assistance. We're basically providing 19% of all the emergency rental assistance is happening in our jurisdiction. We're second only to Metro Housing Boston. That gives you a sense of the housing crisis that low income and working families are facing in our region who can't make ends meet, where everything is costing more, not just their housing, but their transportation, and in places outside of the MBTA communities, we have very poor public transportation. So when we put the housing and transportation costs together, it really tips household budgets in a way that makes it tremendously difficult for folks to make ends meet, and causes toxic trade-offs for those households, whether they pay to rent, whether pay for medical issues, just to put food on the table. And so those are the things that we see every day, with thousands of people coming to us seeking assistance for housing, seeking assistance for emergency mental assistance, just to sort of stay afloat.
So I want to pick up on Josh's distinction between the two levels of affected households, and focus for a minute just on the low income folks. Am I right in imagining that one of the consequences for those folks is a significant increase in evictions and homelessness? I don't know, Lydia, are you in a good position to answer that?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what, not only is, let's just, one increase is increasingly, because of what Keith just talked about, more and more people are now considered low income, and they used to be middle, working class. So let's just start with that. You're now, what is considered lower income is ticking up. And then, yes, there are people who can't hold on anymore. And they're just, they've tried, they ruined their credit by trying to pay rent. And that's one of the cruelest things I think we can talk about, is the fact that we use credit scores in some of our low income lotteries, when we know that credit score, oftentimes you paid everything, you didn't pay other things because you were paying rent. You find that people are getting more eviction notices, and then they have no place to go because they're low income and can't afford market, but they're too rich for a voucher, which we don't have enough of either. So now where do they go? And we just allow for this gray area floating, horrible mental, emotional stress on children and the parents or individuals. And we are creating this ghost class of renters that kind of just disappears and isn't coming up on anyone's statistics, because they're in and out of housing security. And so yes, not only are we, and I want to talk about the fallout as not just evictions, but what evictions and displacement do to children when they're learning. Statistically, they have the same stress, anxiety, and depression as children who are homeless. And so you are finding a generational traumatic impact as well that goes from the parents pass down, not intentionally, obviously, but it passes down, the children absorb it, they cannot learn well. And so how does that impact them as they're trying to grow out of economic or into economic prosperity, the ability to go to college? All of this comes down from us, I say collectively, society, not seeing housing as the infrastructure that it is. It is an infrastructure that deserves the same attention as our roads, as our clean water. It needs to be seen as a sign of a successful first world country, that you can house the people there. And we don't see it that way.
Yeah. So then turning to the other tier in Josh's distinction, there has been, and a couple of you already touched on this, but I wonder if we can think a little more about it. There's been an awful lot of talk in political circles in Massachusetts in the last 6 months about the state's competitiveness and about whether we're losing or why we're losing population. I think sometimes those numbers are exaggerated, but it's clearly a big focus. How much of that is a housing problem?
I'll just jump in. I think it's significant. I think people are looking for, if you're a mobile family, meaning you have options, you have choices, right? You're looking for a place where maybe you want to grow your family. You're looking for a place that you can afford, where you can see a kind of a housing ladder. Yet you might go into that starter home or that affordable rental apartment, but then you want to be able to see a path to home ownership for your family. It's harder and harder to see that here in Massachusetts, unless you're at an upper income level. And so people are making choices about that are very rational, right? Where and where's the other economic opportunity for me, right? So in terms of jobs, and as we look at the mobility around jobs today, coming out of the pandemic, where people being able to work more remotely and virtually, it creates lots of good things. I think it's not to be moored to one place, but it creates a competitiveness challenge, not just for Massachusetts, but any higher cost area, but with higher costs because of taxes, higher costs because of the lack of affordability and the supply issues we're talking about are going to drive people to make choices. And so, as some of us may recall, last June, Mass Inc. put out an analysis of their own that says that we'll lose college-educated population by 2030 if we don't do some things, address some of these issues, and upwards of almost 300,000 college-educated folks losing from Massachusetts. So, from a competitiveness issue, that's not a good statistic or a good trend. And so their rationale, and I actually gave a talk to our local EDC about this, their rationale was you need to address, yes, taxes, but you also need to create more housing options to make this a place of choice and opportunity for families as they grow and as they advance in their careers and lives.
So I had one more area I wanted to look at in terms of the impacts and consequences is the effects that the stresses on the housing market has on transportation issues and on related climate issues. And I wonder if any of you are in a position to comment on that or on any of the other sort of secondary effects of the crisis.
I mean,
Go ahead, Sally.
thank you. Yeah, no, look, if you can move across the state relatively easily, and with reliability and affordability, then that means your housing options should be opened up so that you don't necessarily have to move to Boston, a market that is not many incomes cannot sustain. So we need to build along in a huge way across the state so that people have the true housing options that we want. That is directly connected. Actually, I mean, one perfect example of connecting housing and transportation is the MBTA bill that passed last year. That's requiring cities and towns that have an MBTA commuter rail stop to build around it at a much better density, and that's necessary. It's necessary for housing options, but it's also necessary that we recognize, as Josh Zakim had said, many cities and towns, due to systemic racism, classism, have gone out of their way not to build. And it's really important that we really say that, because it wasn't just lack of money, lack of investment, lack of. We had plenty of all that. And cities and towns, some went out of their way to not extend the red line into Arlington, went out of their way to have racial covenants, went out of their way to only build senior housing, one bedrooms. And that was for racist purposes. And so we have to obliterate that as well, and also acknowledge that people need to be able to move on transit and be able to afford it. I'll just say this, the study that came out 2 years ago that demonstrated what it means for a lot of Black and brown commuters. On average, they're losing 2 weeks of their life going to work because of what we've done in terms of displacing many of them, putting them further and further away from their work centers because they can't afford to stay in Boston, for example, which all the populations went up in Boston except for Black people. We went down 6% in Boston, where you're finding many of them being displaced due to housing.
And if I can just add on to that, Peter, you mentioned climate as well. First of all, I agree wholeheartedly with everything Lydia just said, but the climate, you could talk, an old triple decker is more climate friendly than, a LEED certified single family house that, on an acre of land. It is imperative that we address this issue. It's not just the emissions from transportation, but it's the way people are living. It's the building itself that can do so much more, and provide that access to opportunity, educational opportunity as well. As long as we have an educational system that is funded by local property taxes, that is only accessible to kids who live in a particular community. The issue of housing affordability is going to be a huge challenge to creating social mobility, building wealth, creating more equity in our communities. And, you know, as challenging as this is for us, I think it's going to be easier to build more affordable housing in many of those communities than breaking down the way we fund and allow access to public education in the Commonwealth. So that's another tool that we need to be talking about. Yes, it's about keeping people in their homes. There's a moral obligation to that. Housing is a human right, but it's also an economic development. If you want to talk about just economic development, it's critical. Keith talked about people leaving the Commonwealth. You know, we already have to combat the good weather options that other places can offer that we certainly cannot. We need to be competitive on cost when it comes to housing, and it's a solvable problem through smart policy, through smart investments. We can do this. None of us here, I think, are breaking new ground on these suggested policies. We know what works. It's a question of the political will. It's the question of organizing, it's of having thoughtful, forward-thinking leaders like Senator Edwards and others who are doing this work. And we can solve this in Massachusetts. We can address climate issues. We can address issues of equity, of access, and economic development all at once if we got serious about this.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in there and maybe make this a statewide discussion a little bit here, in terms of the intersectional issues with housing. You know, here in Western Massachusetts and other states that have a significant rural population, the lack of investment in housing, both creating new housing and growth, and investing in our existing housing stock has many related and intersectional impacts. And we see them all the time. So what am I talking about? We see the fact that we have declining population. So we see healthcare institutions start to close different aspects of what they're providing. They close maternity wards. They close certain types of acute care. People have to drive not half an hour, but an hour and a half to get to those facilities. We see declining school enrollment. And so we see a decline in some places in tax revenue, which help in terms of the municipal infrastructure to be supported. You need to have a solid tax base, but in these same communities, the irrational choices that people make to prevent new housing production, whether it be affordable or moderate income or even market rate in these communities, is really you know, undermining the future of their town, their city, and in our region and the Commonwealth overall. So I think there's a real opportunity in all of this for us to think about what are the communities that we need for the future, not what it was, not even what it is today, but we need to be looking forward. And that's what the failure of our current, the failure of our decisions to this point have been: not looking forward, not building for the communities that we want to create, and for the people who are here and going to be here in a way that addresses all these issues, so that we can all thrive. So that we don't have rising eviction filings, which are in our region approach or at or above pre-COVID levels. So that we have a situation where a senior who wants to downsize from a very old and underinvested in house into an affordable apartment can find that in the same community where they've lived for decades, so that that family can grow and find that third home. We don't have those housing ladders right now in our communities, and they're getting cut off from every direction. But some communities are doing the right thing, and they are creating 40R zones, and they are, even outside of the MBTA communities, they are creating municipal housing trusts. They are creating different opportunities to invest, but there's still too much kind of not in my backyard sentiment there. But I think there are opportunities and there are solutions that are at every level, the local level, the state level, and the federal level, to have that kind of consistent investment that we'll need, as Josh said earlier, not for a year. There's no light switch to flip here. It's a consistent, intentional investment, because that's the only way we get out of consistent, intentional disinvestment, is by doing that going forward.
So thank you all to all three of you. I think I feel like we've painted what the problem looks like, how deep it is, why this is coming to be really recognized as probably the most significant crisis that the Commonwealth is presently facing. And I want to turn now to at least an initial conversation about, what are the policy levers? What are the solutions that are in play? And first, let me just note for people, we've only scratched the surface here. We've put up on the PDM website on our forums page, at the end of the posting for this forum, several resources that we have found helpful in getting greater clarity on the issue, and we encourage you to take a look at that. We encourage you to let us know if there are other resources you think belong on that listing. But as we turn to strategies and solutions, I gotta say, as our working group started looking into this, we just were absolutely overwhelmed by how many different dimensions, how many different proposals, how many different policy changes are being discussed. And I gotta believe that some of the challenge that we're facing is that people like us who are well-intentioned and want to pitch in get overwhelmed and don't know where to focus. And so we're hoping we can help with that at least a little bit. And as we started to dig into this, it seemed to us that there really are three, maybe more, but at least three distinct areas into which the problems and the strategies can be clustered. The first, the most immediate, is we're not going to solve the supply problem overnight. It's going to take, as Josh says, years. What are the measures we need in the short term to protect people from the most harmful impacts of the undersupply? How do we protect tenants? How do we protect homeowners from the burdens and the costs that they are facing and the impacts on the rest of our economy and culture? So that's first, is sort of the mitigation measures in the short term. Then the second, and all of you have at least touched on this, is how do we clear a path that allows us to increase the supply? How do we get rid of the barriers? How do we push back on the institutional racism that makes it difficult to provide opportunities? How do we clear out regulatory barriers? But then the third area is, once we cleared out the barriers, there's still a huge problem of cost. I mean, at least if I understand this correctly, it costs more to create housing than the people who that housing is appropriate for can afford to pay. And without substantial support from some source, probably from some governmental source, how are you going to make it possible to get that housing built? So those seem to us to be sort of the three big clusters: sort of relatively short-term mitigation, clearing out the barriers, and figuring out how to make building more housing affordable. We're going to start in September with a series of forums clustered in those areas. But let me start. Let me ask you, Keith, after the work that you did for the transition and the governor's working group, does this seem like a useful way to organize the key issues? Does it tell us where we should be focusing our attention?
I think it's a fine framing. I think it's consistent with looking and breaking down the issues around affordability and supply that we've been talking about, and that we need to dig into not only from a policy, but from a long-term investment standpoint. And so when you think about those kind of keeping people housed in the immediate term, in each of these areas, we have things that we know that work, right? So I appreciate the points that you were leading into. Yes, it's complex, but let's not be overwhelmed by the complexity. Let's get focused, right? Let's get focused on what's immediately in front of us to start that investment, to start those intentions, things that are already working for us, right? And so we learned a lot during the pandemic about what works to prevent and protect people from evictions in a way. Some of it may have had some unintended consequences. So let's learn from all of that and then apply the policies going forward. One of the things that we have a challenge with today, and that kind of diminishing federal environment of investment that I was describing before, is that we've then held on to a kind of a housing set of tools that we could just hold on to, right? And we tried to grow them incrementally because there was no new good thinking going on, and no willingness, no political will to invest from a federal level in housing in the way that we need it today. And so we need to modernize our housing tools. Today, as Josh mentioned, the low-income housing tax credit is the biggest federal program. It's a great program. It's a public-private partnership. It gets bipartisan support. It also adds to some of the expense, right? You've got it's using the tax code to invest in housing. Is that the most efficient way to do it? I'm not so sure, but it works. All right, and so we use tax tools, and I'm glad to see what the Senate put forward in terms of some of the tax tools that we have in the Commonwealth. Those are actually forms of innovation, right? Having a state level investment using the tax code the way we're already using with the state low income housing credit, housing development incentive program, and other brownfields tax credit programs and other things like that we have here. So we do need to build on and modernize them for the future and meeting our needs. That some of that is about scaling those resources to meet the need of today, not what they were. And some of that is about making them easier to use so that it creates lower cost outcomes for developers. We are also a developer and manager of housing. So we see it from all angles, both from the resources that we're trying to provide to keep people stably housed, and things like the RAFT program have been tremendously successful in doing that. I was just at a housing conference, and I'll stop here, National Housing Conference last week in Chicago, and they don't have RAFT in other states.
Can you say one sentence about what RAFT is?
Sure, it's an emergency financial assistance program that's focused today on renters, low-income renters, to keep them housed, and so basically they are able to get a short-term subsidy to help them pay rental arrears if they've had a dip in their income or other things that affect their economic outcomes where they're having trouble paying rent. So the Commonwealth has this program. Pre-COVID is a $20 million a year program. Now, depending on where the budget will end up for this year, it'll be somewhere between $160 to $200 million. And because there's a need, we found the need. The federal government was providing tremendous resources, and we kept people housed. Those eviction levels that I was talking about, eviction filings, dipped dramatically during COVID, where we thought there was going to be a surge in evictions. That was a success. We should build on that kind of success. And when you don't see that, what you start to see is disinvestment in housing. And that's what I was hearing from my national colleagues. They're seeing millions of dollars in rental arrears for affordable owners. That means they don't have the money to put into keeping their buildings up, to keeping staff employed. And so they're having to make those trade-offs at that level, not just individual households, but on an ownership level. And that's a recipe for disaster for all of us. So we have tools like that. We know what works in those regards, and some of the there's many other things on the production side that I could talk about, but I'll let my colleagues jump in.
Yeah. So, Josh, tell us how you're thinking about how we can think about solutions.
Well, since I'm not in office anymore, I can say, and sorry, Senator, but mandates from the state, the local control of zoning and housing production has not served us well in this area. And MBTA communities is a great start. 40B, has been great, but I think we need to update some of these. We need to say, some other states have taken steps recently that take local control away from cities and towns if a proposed project housing development has certain income levels are met. And I don't know exactly what the right number of that is. Maybe it's 50% at 60% AMI or lower. Maybe it's 40% at 80%, whatever it is. We need to be setting, I think, some standards that say, if your housing proposal meets this standard, has this number of affordable units at different levels, you are presumed to have approval to do this. Your certification is going to come through the state, not through local zoning, in much the way that 40B has served for several decades to create more housing in many of our suburban communities. I think that's really important. I also think we need to be more efficient with public resources, subsidizing affordable middle-income housing, something that we've seen recently. Mass Housing, I think, has started doing it. The city of Boston has been doing it through an acquisition opportunity program. I believe the city of Worcester and other municipalities are doing it, is using government resources, and much of this has been ARPA money, which is now not going to be available as it once was, but a program should continue, of talking to homeowners, landlords, either individual homeowners or landlords, and saying, we're going to give you X amount of money to, if not permanently, for 30, 40, 50 years, put a deed restriction on this property, that it's going to be affordable. And that, from an efficiency standpoint, I think, Peter, you were mentioning how expensive it is to build housing, to build a new unit of affordable housing. And I hesitate to say this with Keith here, because he probably has a much better and more precise number. But we're talking about $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 per unit to build that. If you can then instead take public resources and say, listen, Mr. and Ms. Landlord, for $75,000 for this unit, we're going to give you this right now. You're going to put a 50-year deed restriction on it, that this will always be for someone who's making 70% or 80% AMI. That's probably going to create a lot more housing, affordable housing for the longer term than building from the ground up. So there's a lot of different tools in the toolbox. I do think, again, it's easy to say money, but we always need more money for this. But the stuff that doesn't cost any public dollars are zoning reforms and mandates from the state level to municipalities to do more.
So, Senator, you are still a public official, and you're right in the middle of this. Tell us how you're thinking about approaching solutions.
Well, for one thing, I think what's most important is that we really understand that we absolutely can solve this. And I think there's this kind of defeatist, we don't really know what we're going to do. I can't remember who wrote the moonshot article about housing. That really, we really need to see it this way. This is one of the greatest challenges of our generation. We need to talk like that. We need to think like that, that all hands, all perspectives. This is one of the great things that we can, 10, 15 years from now, people can say they took this and fixed this and made this something. So that's one aspect. And when you have that sense, and I've told this to the mayor, and I will tell this to Secretary Augustus, he and I are meeting next week. When you have that perspective that this is something we can actually all do, if all of us do just enough, then we tend to work really well. The state, if we rally behind housing like we do around the Celtics or the Red Sox, I swear to you, we would have this sense of, we got to give a little, we got to do a little, everyone has their part. And so what does that mean to give a little and do a little? Sure, you have the MBTA laws, but if you don't have that with appropriate mandates or incentives to build the affordable housing within them, my biggest concern is that they're just going to build and practice the same exclusionary racist policies that they've been using for years to make Newton as wide as it is, to make Weston as wide as it is, to make them, and just continue that on. And so you can build according to what you think is right, but unless we mandate that race, that class is part of your mandate of this law, to make sure that everyone has a home in your community, then we are going to miss the boat. So that's, and this is regulatory, right? The law is the law. This is really totally within our hands. As I mentioned before, using credit as background checks. This is regulatory. This is low-hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. This is why we wait until a notice to quit before people are considered housing insecure for RAFT in many cases. Why? This is an upstream issue. Why not the minute that you qualify for unemployment because you lost your job? You should be applying for and get in line for RAFT. These are administrative, quick things that have nothing to do with law or even political will. I'm not saying I'm trying to put it off my shoulders, but I am saying that these are quick little things that you can do that really just immediately begin to move the system much faster. Another thing that is a law, though, that I think is a small little tweak. We have condo conversion laws, and not every, but tens, 20s of cities and around the Commonwealth, very, very popular. And they provide protections. They provide right of first refusal for tenants. They provide all of these different things. And in Boston, we upped it, $10,000 for regular tenants, $15,000 for move out if you're going to be a senior or low income or have disability. But they all apply to buildings that are 4 units or more. So I have this tiny little bill that basically just removes the word for. And so it would apply to all condo conversions. That would save my neighborhood of East Boston. It's too late for South Boston. It's too late for a lot of places that have triple deckers or condo conversions. So these little tweaks, these small things, and then of course there's dealing with the court system. I believe 100% if you want to stop evictions and you want to have softer landings, you want a more just legal system, you need access to counsel, right? That is a legal and financial commitment. And along with incentivizing cities and towns to build more, there are landlords who are currently housing and renting below market as we speak. There is no incentive for them to do that anymore. And I believe in the Senate budget, we are getting very close to an incentive to do that, which would provide a tax break, or at least a local option for cities and towns to provide a tax break to landlords who are renting below market, to that middle working class person, senior or family who does not have a voucher. They are paying rent. And I think that that's really needs to be said again. There are people paying rent right now who have given a decent regulatory and break of some kind would continue to pay rent. They're not a cost right now. So we can do certain things to incentivize those things. And of course, I'm sure the albatross in the room is whether we should just implement rent control, right? Sure. I can tell you right now, rent control in East Boston, when I just saw the rents on the Eddy, which is $3,000 for a studio, $3,500 for a 1-bedroom, and $4,500 for a 2-bedroom. These are the starting prices. Control that. You can put in rent control right now for that, and it wouldn't apply because the building's less than 15 years old anyway. But according to the Michelle Wu's thing, but put rent control on that. Incomes have not kept up in any way, shape, or form that's going to cause anything but displacement, even with rent control. So what's going to incentivize landlords to lower the rents or not to raise them anymore beyond the mandate that I know many people want in rent control? Rent control would work where there are a lot of cities and towns where the rents are still sustainable. But I really question, but again, these are all tools in the toolbox. And the other thing is to trust. I know we don't trust them on zoning, Josh. But I know we don't trust the local cities and towns on zoning, but we should trust them when it comes to transfer fees. We should trust them when it comes to rent control, rent stabilization. We should be trusting them when they're trying to do progressive things, as where we should place trust in local communities.
So, boy, I really wish we had time for another round of conversation around these, but that's why we're going to do a series more of these discussions. We hope that we can bring you three back for one or more of those future discussions in the fall. We have a wonderful group of others who we're going to bring in. This is a huge challenge, but I want to buy into Senator Edwards' emphasis. We can solve this. We're going to all have to dig in. We're going to all have to take it really seriously and prioritize it, not just the ones of us who get elected to office. So we will return to that. I can't say enough by way of thanks, Keith, Josh, Lydia, for
Thank you.
all you've done on this and for joining us today. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to bring in more participation from the people who are joining us. We will have opportunities for that in the future. But thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good weekend.
You too. Have a good